You see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, rosebuds bright and bright stars through the perilous sky. All the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets like a light, the bombs bursting in our gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Speakers today, we have Mr. Douglas Gibbs, President of the Constitution Association. Mr. Keith Hardine, author, constitutionalist, a self-defense rights expert. And our first speaker, Mr. Steve Jackson, who serves on the leadership team at Huntington Valley Baptist Church, assists the pastor on Sundays, loves God and country. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's been with the Institute on the Constitution as a volunteer instructor for over 20 years. He's a chapter leader with the SoCal Institute on the Constitution. He's a frequent speaker and lecturer on the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and America's Christian heritage. He taught U.S. Constitution at Calvary Chapel Bible College and tutored 8th grade homeschoolers on the U.S. history and Constitution. He's presently a board member of Eagle Forum, California, and Victory Ranch Christian Camp. He believes the Bible and our Declaration of Independence and Constitution are still the answers to America's problems. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steve Jackson.
Thank you so much. I'm going to see if I can put this back in the stand. Hear me well. Major football Constitution event, knocking the flag over. I want to thank Keith and you all for inviting me to speak today. I'm not sure how it was that all came to be. It may have had something to do with
Big microphone.
I may have to end up holding this. Okay? I think I can do that. All right. At any rate, okay, we'll make this brief. Doctrines. That sounds like a dry topic, doesn't it? I'm going to speak on one of the important doctrines of the Constitution. What is a doctrine? Well, it's a teaching, and it's a very important teaching. It's something that basically is foundational. It's something that is vital to understanding something. So there are several doctrines in our Constitution, and many of them are taught in schools today. Balance of powers, that kind of thing. But one of the doctrines is kind of neglected. In fact, I think that's done intentionally. The doctrine of enumerated powers. I submit that it's the most important doctrine in the Constitution. I submit that it's the keystone, the very keystone of the document, the doctrine of enumerated powers. Well, what are the keys to good government? We're not seeing too many examples of good government in our country these days, it seems, or bad government. But what are the keys to good government? I would submit that there are two. The first being character. That's a very important thing. We've been through, 2 or 3 weeks now of interviews of Mr. Kavanaugh to assess his character. I don't know what you've thought about that whole circus, but I don't think they're particularly interested in the issues or really what his character's about. It's all about delaying something that Donald Trump wants to do. It's try to put stumbling blocks in front of the Trump agenda, let's face it. But character is important. The early leaders of our country were very exemplary in their character. Unfortunately, the people who get elected to political office today don't seem to demonstrate that very well. We're not really here today to talk about that, however. We're here today to talk about the other important aspect, the other important key to good government, and that is limits. It takes both. It takes persons with character, and it takes limits. That's what the Constitution is really all about. It organizes and limits the powers of the federal government so that it has only enough power to protect we the people's safety and happiness. Okay? Laws are written to control, let's face it. The Declaration of Independence says that the source of law and rights is God. And the purpose of civil government is to protect our God-given rights. Governments make laws to control the people, to prevent the violation of the rights of others. My friend Keith is going to speak, both Keiths are going to speak to that issue. Doug and Keith. The Constitution was written by the people to control the federal government, to prevent it from violating the people's God-given rights. They had had the whole King George III experience fresh in their minds. They knew what it was like to live under tyranny, real tyranny. And they wanted to make absolutely sure that they set up a system that would not be even possible to have a tyrant arise in our country. The Constitution is the supreme law of our land. It says so in Article 6. It is organic law, which means that it's the basis upon which all other laws are made and enforced or negated. It organizes and limits the powers of the federal government, as I've said. The topic of limits on government. It is an important topic. George Washington said, "Government is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master." The best way to prevent a government from abusing a power is not to delegate it that power in the first place. The Constitution grants to the federal government, or the general government, as it's often referred to in those days, only those powers that of necessity it must have to secure we the people's safety and happiness, as I said. So what is this doctrine of enumerated powers? Well, it can be found in the body of the Constitution. In fact, there's a very strong indication of it right there in Article 1, Section 1, with these words. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. Now today, the Congress likes to operate as if it says all legislative power shall be vested in Congress. But it doesn't say that. It says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. As James Madison tells us, every word of it decides a question between power and liberty. And there's no better example of that than right there in Article 1, Section 1, the words herein granted. Article 1, Section 8 says the Congress shall have the power to, and then it lists about 18 different powers that the Constitution vests in Congress. The Constitution gives lawmaking power regarding things like taxing and spending for the payment of debts, for the common defense, and the general welfare of the United States. It can borrow money. It can regulate commerce with foreign nations, interstate commerce, but not intrastate commerce, and trade with Indian tribes. It can establish uniform rules for naturalization and bankruptcy. I've often wondered, is there a relationship between naturalization and bankruptcy? I think there is. How about immigration and bankruptcy? There may be some relationship there. Immigration is just a subset of naturalization, by the way. Therefore, immigration law is the jurisdiction of the federal government. Are you listening, California? It is a legitimate role for the federal government to define a uniform, that's the key word, a uniform rule of naturalization. Uniform meaning for all of the states. It's not up to the states to decide what our immigration policy should be. It has the power to legislate regarding the coining of money. It doesn't say to print money, by the way. It says to coin money, and there's a difference. It's a whole different topic. Real money is not paper. and to fix the standard of weights and measures. I'm reviewing some of these powers that the federal government legitimately has to get to the punchline here at the end. To provide punishment for counterfeiting. That's legitimate since the government coins or prints the money.
Absolutely.
And to establish post offices and post roads. To grant patents and copyrights. Very important role of the federal government. To constitute federal courts below the Supreme Court. At the time the Constitution was written, we only had one federal court, the Supreme Court itself. Congress has created all the other courts in the meantime. To define and punish crimes at sea and violations of the law of nations. I think the other Keith is going to speak a little bit about the law of nations a little bit later on. Congress, and Congress alone, has the power to declare war, to grant letters of marque and reprisal, and to make rules for prisoners of war and so forth. Marque and reprisal, it's a term we don't hear too much of these days. But basically, it's the authority for Congress to issue letters to some person or group, like ship's captains in those days, to go beyond the borders, that's where the marque part comes in, to go beyond the borders of the country, to execute judgment for some sort of, or to execute reprisal for some sort of crime against citizens of our country. Piracy is an example of that type of thing. Because generally, letters of marque and reprisal were issued to ship captains to arm themselves and go off and effectively to try to be part of a navy, which we really didn't have at the time. But it's a broader term and actually involves other things. For instance, the so-called war on terrorism that we're fighting right now could probably have been better handled by Congress issuing letters of marque and reprisal to various military agencies, perhaps private military agencies, to go take out the bad guys that were responsible for 9/11. But that's, again, kind of another topic. But Congress has the power to do that kind of thing. Congress has the power to raise and support armies for 2-year periods, by the way, because they didn't want a standing army, and that was the original plan. To provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for governing armed forces, to provide for calling the state militias to enforce federal laws and suppress insurrections and repel invasions, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and governing those parts employed in the service of the United States, to make laws to govern Washington, D.C., and military installations around the country, to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and other powers vested in the federal government elsewhere in the Constitution. Again, the Congress tends to like that's called the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, and they like to use that to justify making laws and creating programs that aren't specifically authorized in the Constitution because they think it says to make all laws which we think are necessary and proper. Period. But that's not what it says. It says to make all laws necessary and inserted in the Constitution if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power to provide for the common defense and general welfare. Madison, in a speech to the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788, the powers of the federal government are enumerated. It can only operate in certain cases. It has legislative powers on defined and limited objects, beyond which it cannot extend its jurisdiction. I'm thinking of education, health care, labor rules, that kind of thing. Madison in Federalist 45 says, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. We just covered all of them. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects, as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. A very clear explanation of enumerated powers. John Adams. Nothing is more dreaded than the national government meddling with religion. Alexander Hamilton, Federalist 78. There is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution can be valid. To deny this would be to affirm that the servant is above the master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men, acting by virtue of powers, may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. And finally, the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated by the Constitution to the United States, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. A very clear summary of the doctrine of enumerated powers. So, why is it important? Well, obvious. We didn't want to have a tyranny. We didn't want to have some far-off government someplace telling us how to run all of the intimate affairs of our daily lives. And yet today, that's exactly what we have. I brought with me a couple of modest examples. Here's an article that says, Judge Brett Kavanaugh and his wife received multiple death threats. U.S. Marshals now investigating. Ford's lawyer, that's the accuser, writing, Ford and her children have been forced to leave their home to escape harassment, even death threats. And both CBS Evening News and NBC Nightly News found the few seconds needed to mention the death threats against Kavanaugh and his family. We have death threats going on for a nomination for a judge on the U.S. Supreme Court. Why is this happening? Why have recent Supreme Court nominations become so contentious, so vicious, so ugly? Well, it got worse. The worst case, I think, is since Trump got elected. It's the anti-Trump reaction, but I think there's something behind it. And I submit that this is one of the evils that happens when the federal government throws off its chains and ignores the doctrine of enumerated powers. You see, in the beginning, if you read the Constitution, the kinds of cases, the jurisdictions over which the Supreme Court was to have authority, they're very narrow and very limited. But that's not what has happened, because the federal government's got its fingers in everything now. Therefore, the Supreme Court and other federal courts seem to think that they have the ability to judge on these matters, and they make decisions regarding the most intimate matters of our personal lives, against life, regarding the life and death, matters like abortion, same-sex marriage, and all these kinds of things. I submit that that's one of the key reasons for this contentious debate, because the Supreme Court and the whole federal government has exceeded the doctrine of enumerated powers. We wouldn't be having these problems if the Supreme Court was dealing with cases involving U.S. ambassadors and such things. How many people get passionately really concerned about those kinds of things? It isn't the kind of thing you can get too concerned about. But when the feds have their fingers and their cameras and their eyes and their ears in your bedroom, it starts getting personal, okay? That was never intended, and the doctrine of enumerated powers would have prevented all of that. Here's another one. I subscribe to some leftist email types of things, just so I keep my pulse on what they're up to. One of the big ones is called Daily Costs, and they put out some garbage every day about how mean and terrible President Trump is and all the conservatives and how uncaring and hateful we all are. And this says, these are extremely serious allegations against Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh could get a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land where his decisions would affect women's bodies for generations to come. See, that's the point. They shouldn't be making those kinds of decisions at all. It goes on, the Daily Cause community has taken hundreds of thousands of actions to stop Brett Kavanaugh from being confirmed, so forth and so on. Anyway, we could probably all think of many reasons why our country is at risk today, simply because the federal government is exceeding the doctrine of enumerated powers, day in and day out. I think the figure is something like, it's been estimated, 80 to 85% of current federal programs are unconstitutional. Do you think we would have a budget problem if all of a sudden 80 to 85% of all those incredibly huge and expensive federal programs were suddenly declared unconstitutional? I don't think we'd be having debates about taxes and all that kind of stuff anymore. It wouldn't be necessary. The size of the federal government would be trimmed down to what the intent was, and financially we'd be much better off, in addition to just the loss of our basic freedoms. All right, some of you may be asking, well, this is well and good, but what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Well, I'm going to submit that there are some tools that we have for enforcing the doctrine of enumerated powers. And number one on the list has to be, my favorite, education. education. We have to educate ourselves, we have to educate our families and our acquaintances first on what the Constitution says, does not say, what the proper role of the federal government is and is not, and then each of those persons needs to spread that gospel, if you will, those truths, to others in their spheres of influence. Okay? You can do that in many, many different ways. And you can also do it by informing some of these government people that are currently serving that they have limits on their powers. One person in a congressional district saying such things, they're going to ignore you. But if 100 people in a congressional district start badgering a congressman or whoever about unconstitutional acts that they're proposing or whatever, they start picking up your ears and taking notice, because the one thing politicians understand is numbers. They really do. One or two people speaking truth isn't going to mean too much to them. But 100 people in a district speaking truth can make a big difference. So we have to educate ourselves, first of all, and those around us. We have to be up on factual current events, not fake news, but factual current events, so that we can understand how the Constitution applies or is being misapplied to current events. Obviously, voting is an important part of that process. I don't have to remind the people in this room how incredibly important voting is. But vote according to the yardstick that you're supposed to use, the United States Constitution. It is the document to which they all take an oath. Therefore, they have an obligation to you, and we have an obligation to enforce that Constitution. Okay? Not what particular religious beliefs or whatever. That's irrelevant, it turns out. What does turn out is that they take an oath to the Constitution, and so we have to hold them accountable to it. I submit that another important element in this process is one of faith. We have to be grounded in our faith, because ultimately all laws are based on somebody's religious values, and our faith is a very, very important part of the process. We have, of course, a right to assemble peaceably and to petition the federal government for a redress of grievances. It's not one of my favorite things to do, but sometimes there's an appropriate time to gather a large group of people, hopefully get some media attention or whatever, to petition for some legitimate cause. That does have a role, as long as it's peaceful. The people that typically take to the streets today, however, seem to have forgotten that word in the First Amendment, to peaceably assemble.
Yes.
Not to riot and cause destruction and so forth. There's another thing called interposition. The reason that all local, county, and state officials take an oath to the same United States Constitution. I used to wonder about this. Why do they? They're at a different level of government with different jurisdictions. True enough. But the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and every one of them has to be familiar enough with the role of the federal government to spot usurpations and to interpose on behalf of the persons in their state, county, or city in that regard, holding them accountable to the Constitution. That's why all lower-level officials have to take an oath to the Constitution, to demonstrate that they understand the limits of the role of the federal government and to enforce it. Okay? So, nullification is an important part of that process too. Some people hear the word nullification and they cringe. Well, yeah, that's what the South tried to do, to keep slavery alive or whatever. Well, no, there is a legitimate role for nullification. It is specifically written into the Articles. It is not specifically written into the Constitution. But there are a number of quotes from founding fathers, including Madison and Jefferson, which indicate that nullification is a legitimate tool to use. Basically, that says that a state or even a county can say, look, the federal government is trying to unconstitutionally regulate the possession of firearms, for instance. And a Sheriff Richard Mack or somebody of his ilk steps in and says, no, not in my county. What you are doing is unconstitutional. The Second Amendment guarantees Americans the right to keep and bear arms, and you are not going to unconstitutionally come into my county and try to have me and my department help you enforce that unconstitutional law. We are simply not going to do it. Richard Mack stood up, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he won. It takes more people like him at the county and local levels to spot usurpations and to take positive action to interpose on behalf of the people. So nullification is an important tool to use. The 10th Amendment Center, Michael Wolff, I encourage you to go onto the website and join, send them $3 a month or so. Join the 10th Amendment Center. It's all about the doctrine of enumerated powers. 10th Amendment Center, check them out. Violating our Constitution is normally thought of in the context of the president, but other federal officials can also be impeached. The term applies to them too, and the process is the same. The House of Representatives passes articles of impeachment, and a trial is held in the Senate, and if 2/3 of the Senate vote to do so, that person is removed. It's really only been successfully completed about a handful of times. All of them have been federal judges. Other people have been impeached, but the only ones that have actually been successfully been removed have been a few federal judges here and there. But these are all tools that we can use. But education is the number one. Celebrating Constitution Day every year is part of that. Educate yourself and educate others on the Constitution. It all begins there, because without proper basic knowledge about the Constitution, any political action is fruitless or misdirected. So it's important that you become grounded in the Constitution before you get involved in politics. Don't get the cart before the horse. Are there any questions? Do we take
Yes.
questions now? Or
I have one.
If you read one.
You beat me, man.
We have one in the back. Okay.
Yes. You mentioned the 10th Amendment. I want to run something by you, get your thoughts on it. Years ago, when Joe Biden was the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, he made, I think we was on a confirmation hearing with someone, he made a comment that I didn't quite understand at the time. It said basically, because of the 17th Amendment, the 10th Amendment is really irrelevant. But when Mark Levin wrote his book, The Liberty Amendment, and of course one of his crusaders, people love to see the 17th Amendment rescinded. And I, having educated myself in this train of thinking, I've come to despise the 17th Amendment prior to right next to the 16th Amendment, who gave us the federal income tax, which, from probably tax income. So the bottom line is this: as you know, the 17th Amendment took away from the states, as the original Constitution gave to the states, to appoint the U.S. Senators representatives of the states. So now with a popular vote, pretty much the state legislatures and the state's interests are pretty much irrelevant. If you can get a 50+1 popular vote in the state, you have no need to care about the interests of your state legislature, so on and so forth. So what are your thoughts about Biden's comment and then, what your knowledge of the 17th Amendment?
Amen. Last question? I agree completely, and I'm sure that each of the gentlemen that are going to follow me would agree. The 17th Amendment was a terrible, terrible thing. It was passed under false pretenses. The primary one being that there's not enough turnover in the Senate. The legislatures are sending these people back time and time and time again. We need to get the people involved because we live in a democracy, don't we? No, we don't, right? But get the people involved, we'll get more turnover. Okay, what do the facts say? The facts say that there has been more retention, less turnover, since the passage of the 17th Amendment. And you're right. With the passage of the 17th Amendment, the states, as sovereign states, lost their voice in Washington, D.C. We essentially have two houses of representatives now. The Senate is just another house with more legroom. I agree with you completely, and it should be repealed.
Oh, one last thing, Paul. Do you agree with Mark's intention, unless we have an Article 5 convention, the Congress, which can also pass them, would never vote themselves out of the job, so we will never see them rescinded unless you do have an Article 5 convention.
I'm personally opposed to that. That's not why we're here to talk about primarily, but I am personally opposed to it. I think there are other tools that can be used. Okay? Who else? Yes, ma'am.
So I'm a commissioner in Culver City, a civil service commissioner, and I'm finishing out someone else's term. And I took an oath of office to the Constitution, and so I realized I took that oath not being fully educated about the Constitution, which is one of the reasons why I'm here. And I'm really concerned about my city because before I took office, my city declared Culver City as a sanctuary city, and you touched a little bit upon immigration earlier and how that lies in the hands of the federal government. But what can be done locally, because I feel like my own city is breaking the rules, what can we do locally to handle that situation? Because I'm extremely concerned that standing by is going against my oath of office, and I don't know what I can do to...
Thank you for the question. About 3 or 4 months ago, we had the pleasure of attending the enrobing ceremony of our daughter-in-law, Nancy Cash, to be a commissioner in Orange County. And I proudly sat there and watched her take the oath. And I've had several discussions with her since about the meaning of that oath. But to answer your question, Article 1, Section 8 clearly vests in Congress the power to make a uniform rule of naturalization. And immigration is a legal part of the process of naturalization. Article 6 says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the judges, commissioners, doesn't say commissioners, but judges in every state are bound thereby. You are bound through your oath to upholding the fact that it is the role of the federal government, not the city or state government, to establish rules for naturalization and immigration. There is your constitutional argument. Article 1 plus Article 6. Yes, sir.
Would you say being a union member is like being a Democrat? I'll go along with it.
Well, it's true that the unions have kind of dominated the control over the Democratic Party recently. I am more concerned that the Marxists, Socialists, and Communists have dominated the unions, and therefore they're dominating the process. It wasn't always that way. I grew up in a family where all my grandparents were Democrats and so forth, but that was earlier times. And I think JFK was assassinated because he wasn't falling in line with some of the globalist policies and stuff that some people were pushing in those days. I don't divide the world into Republicans and Democrats. Basically, the Constitution is the key. It's the standard, and I weigh everybody according to that yardstick. How do you align with the Constitution? That's the only thing that matters. But yeah, it's unfortunate that those things have happened, for sure. Anybody over here? Yes, ma'am.
I'd just like to ask the question that our California elected officials that have deliberately violated the Constitution and our U.S. federal immigration laws, should they not be removed from office?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And how do we, the people, go about getting them removed from office?
Well, there's the obvious answers of voting and that kind of thing. But beyond that, I was in touch with Congressman Rohrabacher's office, he's my congressman, trying to get him to contact the Justice Department and have them take action against Governor Brown. Why? Because of his recent trip to China and entering into agreements with the Chinese government, basically thumbing their nose at Trump's pulling us out of the Paris Accord, climate change and all that. California is in bed with China on this topic, and they signed an agreement to that effect. And Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution specifically forbids this action. And so I wanted to, and first they kind of blew me off, and I was just insistent on it. Finally, one of the staffers eventually contacted the Justice Department and asked the question and said, yeah, this really is unconstitutional. Why isn't somebody doing something about it? Okay. And the answer was so typical. The Justice Department. Oh, this was a non-binding agreement.
Right.
Whatever that means. The head of a state, the governor, and the government of China entered into an agreement. It's non-binding. Well, first of all, the word non-binding isn't in the Constitution. It says shall not enter into any agreement. Any agreement. So they have interesting and curious ways of backing out of the responsibility. The Justice Department and branches of the federal government could be used to come down on local officials who are trying to exercise powers that are in fact vested in the federal government by the Constitution. So yeah, vote them out or get somebody at the Justice Department or whatever to take action and remove them, because they're violating their oath to the United States Constitution, which they ought to. Okay, anybody else? Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about the 14th Amendment and the role of the courts and the Congress in making sure that the states guarantee due process of law and equal protection of the law?
Well, that was the intent of the 14th Amendment. And of course, it was passed, it was one of the end of slavery amendments, the 13th basically, to oversimplify things again. ended slavery or tried to end slavery. The 14th Amendment attempted to restore full rights to persons who were former slaves, which speaks to your topic, and to ensure that they are, in fact, afforded due process of law. And the 15th Amendment, of course, gave the right to vote. So, the 14th Amendment did not do things like birthright citizenship. I'll just say that right off the bat. And that was very okay. It did, unfortunately, create a situation where the federal government now has some sort of legal grounds, legal in quotes, to interfere with the local and internal affairs of states. It's called the incorporation doctrine. The 14th Amendment's incorporation doctrine basically says that the Bill of Rights is incorporated into the 14th Amendment and that the federal government has the power to enforce that on the states. That is not what the intent of the 14th Amendment was. The incorporation doctrine is a false doctrine. Okay? Let me say that right off the bat. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it is not an open door for the federal government to take over the internal affairs of a state. It was never intended to do that. The author, the primary author of the 14th Amendment, has a lot of important quotes, you can look them up yourself on the internet, assuring the people that this type of thing is not going to happen. But of course, it has happened, because lawyers are lawyers, and power is power, and power seekers will abuse their power. That's just the way it is. I'm probably at about the end of my time, so I think I'll... All right, any more questions? Yes, sir.
Well, I'm going to go a different direction. You mentioned the mark and reprisal clauses, and I just want to know, how do we protect our citizens given the circumstances of the United Nations and everything else with the World Court?
We do what Trump has been doing this last week. Telling them to pound sand. We should never have joined the United Nations. We should get out of the United Nations, and he's not suggesting that at this point in time, but he's basically...
Mr. McConnell specifically say we should leave the United Nations before Trump was elected, and he hasn't done anything about it since.
Well, he has. He's beginning to... It's one thing to stand up and say, I want to get out. That's pretty extreme. But he's basically telling them where their powers end and where our sovereign powers take over. He's making that very clear. And that is so refreshing for me to hear from the President. I don't know about the rest of you. Very refreshing for me to hear.
Okay, one more question?
One more question.
I have a question.
Okay.
Can we get a copy of what you just told us? So that when I go out to speak to others, that I can say, just a moment, and just cite what you said. Because it's based on the facts. It isn't what you just said, because everything that you referred to were part of the Constitution. I need that information.
Well, you have a pocket constitution. That's the most important.
Right.
You're certainly welcome to take a copy of my outline.
I do want it.
And are these videos going to be available?
Good question. Ayala, speak to that.
Yes, Keith is going to take care of these, and I'm sure they will be out there for everyone to view.
There's no sure's. We got to know fact. I'll take them to Kiko's. And run them on the floors. I know where to find her.
All of you
Read
have
what's
a
in front of
handout
you,
that I
folks.
provided which says the Constitution Day should be
This is the core.
something more
Yeah.
than a
Start here
mandated
anyway.
federal holiday.
Read it.
I
Know
think
it.
it's a very well-written article that I completely agree with. I had the opportunity to speak to a bunch of 4th and 5th graders in a public school about, well, on Constitution Day, about the Constitution. 4th and 5th graders, this is a challenge. I don't do 4th and 5th grade too well. I don't think that those people have the maturity and the critical thinking abilities to even understand anything about the Constitution. So, it was a difficult task, but I attempted to do so anyway. But I was thinking these same thoughts about how ironic it is that the federal government has a mandate on schools that you teach the Constitution, when there's no constitutional authority for the federal government to dictate anything about education policy. The irony of that is beyond me. It really is. Okay. All right, one more.
Well, just to speak to what you're talking about, I'm wondering, I'm a product of local public education, and when we were in our Constitution, all it was the preamble. That's all we learned was the preamble.
It's a
But
good start.
before I got to high school, they had already taken civics out of the curriculum. So those of you that are already immersed in the Constitution and are out teaching and educating people, how can we get civics back into school? And how can we get real constitutional education back into our school?
Well, the first thing you have to do, you have to deal with the elephant in the room. You have to get the federal government decoupled from education. It is one of those items which the founders absolutely would roll over in their graves if we thought that we had turned any aspect of education over to the general government. They understood the dangers of that. When you have a central government deciding what is official knowledge and disseminating that by edict with power to back it up, you have a problem. Okay? That's antithetical to freedom. So get the federal government out of the education business. That's step. You're not going to be successful with anything else until you do that. Then you can start operating at your state and local level to get genuine Constitution teaching back into the schools, the kind of stuff I'm teaching. Enumerated powers, that particular doctrine isn't even taught in law school anymore. I talk to lawyers all the time. They're lucky to get anything about the Constitution. If they do, they don't get the doctrine of enumerated powers. Why? Because it's too embarrassing. Everybody knows it. Nobody's paying any attention to it. So it's just too embarrassing to try to teach it. It's not a doctrine anymore. Nobody's using it. And yet the 10th Amendment is quite clear. I think my time is up. Thank you and God bless you.
Thank you.
Lords of spacious skies, forever waves of grain. Walk on mountains, majesties above the fruited lands. Oh, come on, America, yeah, sweet, sweet America. God shed His grace on thee, and crowned thy good with brotherhood. From sea to shining sea. Oh, yeah. From sea.
The Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a privilege to present to you Mr. Keith Hardine.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. I heard it mentioned earlier, they were asking about, reaching the youth. I have an idea. I have a plan. You got to reach them with today's cultural, activities. And I use television a lot. I use movies. I use music. Hip hop, the generation that we deal with. I deal mostly with the at-risk, the youth. They call them youth at risk. Many of the kids that I work, because I work for LAUSD.
Wow. Where's your black jacket?
I hope nobody knew that. Anyway, yeah. I can tell you some stories there. As I told some of you, you guys that know me, know some of my stories. But LAUSD, I work in the high school. I've worked from K through 12 in all schools. Even my friend Michael Greer has been to one of my classes before in the school. So it's very interesting. I've had certain classes in some schools and then others they won't allow it. But, I just do what I can. And reaching kids is really not hard. It's not difficult at all. If you use principles that our founders, the tools that our founders gave us. I'll quote a scripture out of 2 Corinthians in the New Testament. It says, "The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God, to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. And you think about what that means for a moment. Casting down imaginations, bringing all these thoughts into captivity. Their thoughts, their minds have been held captive by the enemy. When I say the enemy, they are the enemy of our soul as well as the enemy of our country. And I find a very interesting relevance there. There was some people who would correct me, and many times within the church, some of my colleagues, they'll say, well, you can't associate the Word of God with politics. You know, God's not in it. And I said, well, let me show you where He is. And so that's how you have to talk about it. I mean, is God so small that He's not in politics, and yet He's in everything else, every other aspect of life? Or, you know, when Nancy Pelosi gets up and quotes scripture, is that okay? You know, and yet we can't say anything. You know, I mean, it's amazing to me. It amazes me how much we hear from the left when it comes to morality. And yet we say nothing. Because, you know, certain people may say, in the higher, upper echelons of our party, they may say, in the GOP, they might say, well, let's not talk about social issues. We've already lost that. No, we haven't. We haven't lost that battle. We just don't engage. So I want to engage you just a little bit today. Everything I talk about today, or this short period, I want to focus, I want it to be applied to, this is my actual experience. This is what I do. This is what I actually do. So that's what I'm trying to share with you. And I have a few mentors in the room, and I just want to acknowledge them because I have mentors all over the place. Not just people like Mark Levin and Hillsdale College, Larry Arndt, Dr. Larry Arndt, all those guys. Those are my mentors, you know, and my teachers, so to speak. Thomas West of Hillsdale, that guy is awesome. Let's see, Ted Hayes over here, one of my mentors, expert on 14th Amendment. Michael Greer, another of my mentors. And, you know, I think of these people as important in my life because they listen to me. You know, and that's something you want to be heard. And reason, and it seems that it's not so much heard today. Reason and truth are not allowed in the discussion. Reason and truth and logic are not allowed in any of the discussions. I see this on both sides. I may get into a little trouble, but I'm going to try to avoid most trouble. But I just want to say that we don't always get a chance to hear about reason and logic. So let me share this with you, though. Explaining certain aspects of the Constitution. I'll start with the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. This is important because I see some, and I'm going to go with me for a moment. Let's go on to skin color. We can talk about women, we can talk about skin color, we can talk about LGBT. See, with me, it's all about social issues too, even though we don't like to talk about them. But the left talks about them all the time. Just look at Kavanaugh. That's a social issue they're talking about. Yeah, we don't want to talk about it. Okay, but anyway, let's go with color for a minute. You might see the average, average black person, or person of color, or chattel slave descendant, whatever way you want to say it. And you look at and you speak to them, and they might tell you, well, you know, you guys have heard it. The Constitution wasn't made for us. It wasn't made for you and me, or for me, because I'm black. It wasn't made for you. You're black, so it wasn't made for you. Okay, you might hear that. But then, how would you argue the 3/5 clause to them that allowed certain, you know, like let's just say, my colleagues up here, I'm always open to rebuke, I'm always open to correction. I just want you guys to know that too. I'm always open to correction, and that's very important to me. Because if I miss something, or if I'm wrong or incorrect, I want you guys to correct me. But in that clause, we talk about the 3/5 clause, 60%. We're talking about 60% of the slaves were colored. But wait a minute. Let me go straight to the Federalist Paper 54. This is where I kind of revolutionized my thinking on this. James Madison said, he admits in the laws of the South, the slave, I quote, he said that the slave may appear to be degraded from human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. But he immediately qualifies by noting that if the laws were to restore the natural rights which have been taken away, referring to their natural rights to life, liberty, and property, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants. Do you realize what Madison was saying?
Make them count the whole way.
If you consider the Negroes, that they have the right to life, liberty, and property, equal with with whites, then they have to be included. That was interesting. Madison said that. I quoted it. It's out of Federalist 54. And Madison argued in favor of the slaves. He argued in favor of them being counted. Now then, the other side of the North might say, well, we didn't want to count any of them because you use that as an advantage. It was leverage to gain more power with the South, which is true. The South wanted more power. They weren't considering the principle that Madison was arguing about. But so Madison kind of had him over the, he argued the principle. And this is where I'm going. When you argue with people, when you talk to the left, when you speak to blacks or others who are on the left, because there's a difference, obviously, when you speak to them, you've got to start with the principle. Always argue the principle. Always try to argue the natural law principle. That's my greatest weapon. I use it in the schools. I use it with the left, the liberals. Now you might say, what is natural law? What are you talking about? Because that's what the kids always ask. What do you mean by natural law? Let me just say this before I go back to this. One of the jobs that I have is to make them, or to get them to go to class, to encourage them to go to class. That's a very difficult problem. And if you get them to go to class, do they do the work? Will they produce the work? That's another problem. So getting them to go to class, I'm seeing them in the hallways. That's my classroom. And I tell them, this is my classroom in the hallways. And they say, you want to be the teacher? I am teaching you, right here in the hallways. I want you to understand that you have an obligation, you have a duty when you enter into society. Federalist 33 is also argued by Madison. He talks about when your subject enters into a society, that society, he has an obligation to follow the laws of that society. So when I talk to them like this, they say, oh, nobody's told me that before. And this is the way they say it. Nobody's ever told me that. They never explained it to me that way. And so it actually encourages them. And they go to class. I said, look at the Declaration of Independence. The first paragraph, which people hardly ever quote, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people, united, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Freeze, comma. What is that saying? You have a separate and equal station with your fellow students. You have a station in life. Every man and woman has a place in life that they ought to be. Who determines that? Well, the laws of nature and of nature's God. Well, what's that? What do you mean by laws of nature and nature's God? We'll go into it. But you see, that's where I open up my conversation. And they are curious. What do you mean by laws of nature or natural law? They're both used interchangeably. Common law, fundamental law, natural law, laws of nature, nature's God, all used interchangeably, mean the same thing, come from the same source, God. Simple as that. What if you don't believe in God? They ask me. I'm telling you what I actually go through. Well, let's see. If you don't believe in God, then think about it. The laws of nature still apply, right? Whether you believe in God or not. Oh, okay. This is the way the kids say. I'm giving you, gravity is still gravity, whether you believe it or not. You can't see gravity. You can't really feel it. I guess we could feel it in a sense, but you can't really see it. You get up on the building and jump down, you're going to go down. So kids do also experiments. They find out about the laws of physics and all these different physical laws, and they apply. But there has to be something in place that keeps that law fixed in motion. I asked one kid once, I said, does the earth revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the earth? The kid actually said the sun revolves around the earth. He's a high school kid, and he was serious. I said, well, look, why do you say that? He said, well, look, the sun is moving. You can't see it.
That's sad. That is really sad.
I said, well, do you feel that way because you don't feel like the earth, you can't feel the earth moving? I mean, you can't tell after a while whether you believe the sun revolves around the earth or the earth revolves around the sun. Notice I didn't dispute his belief. I just said, well, natural law is still in place. Now you've got to find out the truth. You've got to investigate and find out what really is the case. This is the earth revolving around the sun. And that's what I left him with. And you know what? That kid respected me. I didn't flat out say, you're wrong.
There you go.
I just said, well, laws of nature are still operating. And so I said, those laws mean that you have a certain place, a station in life that you've got to fulfill. It's your destiny. Speaking of destinies, which I'll get to a little later, is the 14th Amendment, one of my pet peeves. The destiny, and this is the reason it's so important to me, the Constitution as a whole, is because as a black man, as a man of color, as a Negro, as a, I'm using all these terms, as an African American, I don't want to. Personally, guys, just so you know, I like Negro.
Okay.
I'm a
Amen.
Negro. Because that was the founding language. All right, anyway, as a Negro, of African descent, a descendant of chattel slaves, you think about this for a minute. The black, and I don't mean this in a negative way to others, but I'm saying black people in America, they do a disservice to themselves who don't hold this to be sacred, as sacred as the laws of God. I tell you why. Because this was written for us too. We were included, even though our ancestors were brought from a nation by force, against their will. They did not give their consent. They were brought here, brought and forced under the jurisdiction of British law and became under the jurisdiction of the United States law. That's what makes us different as far as jurisdiction is concerned to those who come here illegally from other countries today. They have no jurisdiction here until they are given permission by consent of the governed. But we were given not only permission, but we were forced here by the consent of the governed. So yes, we are under the jurisdiction of the United States. That means that this is our weapon. This is our defense. If you want equal rights, men, women, black, brown, gay, straight, genders, transgenders, whatever you are, you have an obligation to follow this. You have an obligation to follow the fundamental law. This is considered the fundamental law, according to 78, Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton. The fundamental laws of the Constitution should be regarded by judges as a fundamental law. That fundamental law, once again, part of natural law. Okay, let me move on. Hope I swallowed all my food here. Let's see. The political theory of the American founder. This is from Thomas West. And Jefferson, again, Madison, you wrote that. What I was quoting came from, this was written in the political theory of American founding. And when the natural law became the moral basis for interpreting the Constitution, now, when did this happen? When did the Constitution or the natural law become the moral basis for the Constitution? A little before that. Listen to this, Thomas Jefferson in 1793, and the Declaration was 1776, but then even before that, I'll get to it. It says Thomas Jefferson here, his opinion on the French treaties. This is Thomas Jefferson. He said that the law of nations, he wrote, is to be composed of the moral law of our nature. I'm reading slowly on purpose. I want you to digest this. It takes time to digest this stuff. I've done this for years. But it is the moral law, think about this, which man has been subject to by his Creator, and of which his feelings or conscience, as it is sometimes called, are the evidence with which his Creator has furnished him. Isn't that consistent with the Declaration? It is. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident. That means they should be evident to everybody. That's right. That all men are created equal. See, again, reason and revelation is not allowed in the public discussion. I want you to remember that.
That's right.
Reason and revelation is not allowed. Revelation, I mean revelation of the scriptures. This comes from the Holy Bible. And yet it's not allowed in discussions, in most discussions. So, reading on further, and this is again his opinion on the French treaties in 1793. The moral duties which exist between individual and individual in the state of nature accompany them into a state of society. And the duties of all the individuals composing the society constitutes the duties of that society towards any other. So that between society and society, the same moral duties exist as did between the individuals. You see where he's going? So the duty that I am obligated as an individual to follow the laws of nature is the same duty that all of you and all of our nation, and not only our nation, but the Declaration does something unique. It says, all mankind. Now, ladies, don't be offended by mankind. You know what he's talking about.
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't know what I would say to anymore.
Yeah, but I do that because I do it on purpose. Because when I'm talking to the kids, you know, they're very politically. Believe me, these kids, especially in high school, they're very politically aware. They know what's going on, and they know all these certain words and everything. I want to deviate just for a minute. Because these stories, I love these stories. I got to tell you. A couple of girls walked up to me and they said, "Mr. Keith," they call me Mr. Keith, and they said, "Can we ask you something?" I said, "Sure." Two girls, and these are high schoolers, and they said, "What do you think about two girls getting together, you know, married, you know, lesbians?" They were lesbians, and I said, "Oh," I said, "You guys are both lesbians?" Like that, and they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Oh, well, I like you because you know I knew them. I like you guys, but I don't like the belief system of lesbianism or gay or homosexuality. I don't like it." I distinguished with them. I wanted to explain the difference. I like you, but I don't like what you stand for. And I had to say it like that. It's very important because you can say, "I like Kaepernick, but I don't like what he stands for." Or, you know, the left will say, Kaepernick is taking a knee at the national anthem. He loves America just as much as you. Well, we know that. But no, you don't tell them. He likes America. Oh, but he has a right to express that he hates America. Now think about that. Oh, think about that. This is what you got. When you talk to the kids or when you talk to young people, this is a real challenge sometimes. But you have to understand where they're coming from, where they're thinking. Anyway, I don't want to.
How do they react when you told them
The lesbian,
that you like them?
I said I like them, but I don't like lesbianism. I don't like, you know, two girls or two women marrying or two men being together like that. I said I don't like that. That's not what I did because I said this. It's against the laws of nature. That just shut the whole conversation down. They said okay. Yeah, they said okay. See, so once I said it's against the laws of nature, it shut the whole conversation down because I explained to them what I mean by the laws of nature. So you got to be able to explain yourself and what you mean by something. Anyway, I'm running short of time. It seemed like that time just really went away. Oh, okay. Okay. What was it, Clarence?
I'll just make it real quick. I don't know if people picked up really what you were doing. I know you shared many examples with me of this and others who know you in the past about this, but what you were doing in that example, I hope people hear this, especially those of us who are labeled quote-unquote conservative. He was doing what the old saying about love the sinner or hate the sin.
Yeah.
That's what he did, so he did not lose them as people.
Yeah.
A lot of times that's our downfall.
That's right.
Okay. And he did it in love, and obviously I wasn't there, but obviously he kept them. He had an open door to their heart and mind. He didn't reject them as people.
And
I hope you picked up on that.
And that saved me in a lot. That saved me in a lot of situations. You know, I talk with kids. You know, it's really amazing. I would tell you this one. I don't know if this is.
Go for it.
Anyway, you know, there's. I don't know. You know, I mean, it's kind of weird because of what's going on today and all this sexual. You know, the things that are going on. I was opening the. I stand at the front gate. I open the gate at 7. Kids are coming in. These are high school kids. And so I say, good morning. I say to the kids, good morning. I had my flag, I had a fan that's an American flag. I held it up and I would say the Pledge of Allegiance. And as they were walking in, all of a sudden the principal's coming. What are you doing? She said, what are you doing? Just like that. I said, well, we're saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Come to my office. So I get called in the office, and so both the principal and the vice principal, the assistant,
Did they have a cross there for you?
and they sat me in the office and they said, we don't say the Pledge of Allegiance. I said, why not? And once again, when you're talking to liberals, you got to play dumb.
Yes.
You know, just say, yeah, no, that really, why? Why not? I mean, I thought the Pledge of Allegiance was it's a normal, natural thing, for Americans. And she says, no, because it might offend some people, usual stuff. So I said, oh, well, okay, I tell you what, I won't say the Pledge of Allegiance with them in the front of the gate, but guess what? I still say it on the yard. I may walk up to them and say, do you guys understand the Pledge of Allegiance? You know why we say it? And that's what I do. Do you know why we say the Pledge of Allegiance? Do you know why we say the Pledge? And I walk up to them and I say it that way. I haven't had any problems since. But of course, I got called on the carpet for it. So that's just one incident. Anyway, yes?
You ever
Lady
been called on
King.
the carpet talking to the students regarding homosexuality? Because you know how the administration is.
Yeah, they've never, no, I've never been called to the carpet for talking about homosexuality, because in the light that I speak about it and I talk about it, I always keep it intellectual, on an intellectual basis, talking about the natural law and why we should, hold your question for why we should, write your question, don't forget them, hold on to it, I don't fit. Why we should, follow the laws of nature. And I always say that, I say it like that. And I use the analogy of Star Wars, of course. Star Wars, if you remember, was, I heard Yoda, Master Yoda said to his protege, he said to Luke, he said, learn the ways of the Force. That's your defense. Learn the ways of the Force. And I say natural law, that's where it starts. And the kids they understand it. And I understand it since I've been out, because I've been taking some time off because I had a little surgery done. But I took some time off, and my colleagues, everybody was asking for me. They were saying, where's that natural law guy? Yeah, where's that Constitution guy? That's what they go. They always call me the natural law man. Anyway, yeah, see, so that's it's working, but it just you've got to know how to present it to them. Now, Emer de Vittel, here's a guy, I'm not French, I don't speak French, but forgive me if I mispronounce it. Jefferson's view was influenced. Now, Jefferson had his views, and it was a very strong view on natural law and the origin of natural law. In his view, he cites French philosopher Emer de Vittel, his idea and the general principles of the law of nations. Vittel says that, translated into English in 1760, based on the French original of 1758, to establish on a solid foundation the natural rights and obligations of nations. Listen to this blows my mind. Nations, or states, wrote Vittel, are bodies, political bodies, societies of men, united together for the purpose of promoting their mutual safety and advantage by joint efforts of their combined strength. The law of nations is the science which teaches the rights subsisting between nations and states and the obligations corresponding to the rights, as men are subject to the laws of nature, and as their union in civil society cannot have exempted them from the obligation to observe those laws, since by that union they do not cease to be men. Again, let's go back to Madison 54, Federalist. He acknowledged the slaves as men and women, as persons. Let's put it that way. Madison was acknowledging the slaves as persons. Whatever you might say about Madison, he had slaves. Yes, he had slaves. But he argued in favor of the slaves as being persons. So all this talk about we were considered 3/5 human is a lie. It's false. It's not true. They said that Madison argued in favor of the slaves as persons. And when he did that, he said that because they are persons, they deserve the same rights as whites. That's what he was arguing. in that whole setup. All right, but anyway, I wish I had so much more time. As we go on, the entire nation whose common will is but the result of united wills of the citizens, remains subject to the laws of nature and is bound to respect them in all their proceedings. So the laws of nature is the basis for human law. But we've thrown that out. And now we regard only human law. And that's where the South was wrong. They were saying that by human laws, we can have whatever laws we want based on our own whim, which is the law that says that the black, that, you know, the slave is to be 3/5 human. And therefore, you know, we used to be subjugated to the whites. And that was in the Confederacy that also Alexander Stevens of the Confederacy, the vice president of the Confederacy, he said that basically, that the black man should be subject to the white man. It is their natural state. See how he perverted it? And it's the same way they pervert it today. Hold your question, guys, I'm almost there. Hey, when do I get to my 10 minutes so I can ask him a question? I'm
After this.
Okay. All right, hold on. I'm going to skip some of this but I think you get the idea, the message of what I'm trying to say. The laws of nature is the best argument you can use against the left because they have no defense against it. You will shut them down, just like they shut us down, a lot of us down. They shut us down because we don't have an argument. You know, let's say, you're a racist, and then that ends the whole thing. Why do you call me a racist? I mean, what have I done that's racist? If I hold the same view, I mean, go deep with them. I mean, if they don't want to go there, fine, let them walk away. I mean, I do it all the time on Twitter. You know, they just walk away. But that's okay. At least you get the point out. You say, well, what do you mean racist? I mean, if all men are created equal, then how can I be a racist if I believe that all men are created equal? Do you believe that all men are created equal? See? And created equal by God? No, God doesn't come in. He doesn't enter into this. You remember the movie, was Dinesh D'Souza, when he's asking Antifa, the leader of that, the founder of that? Remember what he did? He said, do you believe in God? No. You believe all men are created equal and unalienable rights come from God? No. Okay, then there it is, right there. So these are things, if there is no God, unalienable rights don't exist. Rights are alienable. And that means if they're alienable, they're subject to change, the whim of whoever is in charge. Whatever tyrannical force is in charge, those rights are subject to their whim. You follow what I'm saying? Everybody's with me on that? Yeah. Okay, why don't we go to questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, in your school.
Well, I meant him right there. Yeah. Oh, okay.
I didn't know he had his hand up.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I made a mistake.
Go ahead.
Okay, he's about the one about the 3/5.
Yeah.
Okay, in the Constitution, it says the representatives come from, according to the size of the district they come from. That's how many representatives you have. Well, in the South, they didn't have enough population. They wanted to get around that. So they declared slaves as persons. They did that, but only 3/5 persons. So this way they had limited rights, but they could be counted for.
Okay. Well, let's go through an exercise real quick. Notice he said 3/5 persons, right?
Yeah.
So how do you get anybody that's good at math?
Maybe
What's
an
that mean?
arm and a leg.
Okay. Is that 3/5 person? What is that? I mean, if I'm 3/5 of a person, what part of me is a person and what part of me is not?
Oh, hey, I got to go one for you. I have several books at home on the Constitution. One of them is a graphic book in that it has pictures just like a comic book. And it goes right from the history of the United States with the Constitution and all that. And it shows pictures of people and drawings. When it came to that part, it shows that the black people from now on are shown cut in half. Every time you see them in a picture, you only see like a little bit more than half a person.
Yeah.
And then when the Constitution came out, it changed that later on. Now you see them as persons.
I asked the
It's an
history.
illustrated book, but it's one of my favorites.
I asked the history teacher in my school. Okay, he's like that. He's more conservative. And I talked to him. We have all the discussion all the time. I said to him, Mr. Say the name, but anyway, I said to him, it's really interesting how evolution. They talk about rights and they talk about social justice and everything. But every time I look at one of those in those history books and I see the evolutionary chain, where you see from the Neanderthal man to man, you ever look at that? And you look at, have you ever seen any black people in that? They always are. I mean, think about it for a moment. Gosh, you know, you gotta, this is the way you talk to these kids and these leftists. I've never seen, it seems that from the Neanderthal to the man, it looks like a white guy. It's not a black guy. Oh, anybody know what I'm talking about? Anybody get it? So anyway, I mean, I just throw that out there to them. You have to see their reactions. And they, oh, get out of my room. Get out of here. And those are the kind of things that you have to do in the educational field.
Okay,
Yes,
just much quicker. How much, or how are you saying your school totally encompassed Common Core? Would you say?
Yeah, they do.
So they don't really teach much American history.
So
If they do, it's not true.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
And forgive my ignorance, you talked about the Federalist Papers in Madison. What's the relationship between our Constitution and those Federalist Papers?
Excellent. Maybe Mr. Gibbs will go in deeper because of time. I don't know if I got. Let me just start out. Let me just say this: the documents by the state of California. I'm paraphrasing, but the state of California, the law says they are supposed to graduate having read the Declaration of Independence, U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, Federalist Papers, and a few of the, Northwest, or not the Northwest Ordinance, but Gettysburg Address. Okay, they're supposed to have read those. The Federalist Papers, you can't read. Let's see. In my opinion, and I don't know how Doug would say put it, but in my opinion, you can't really read and study the Constitution without understanding or studying and reading the Federalist Papers and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. So all of those, Bill of Rights is like a reflection of the Declaration of Independence, dealing with natural rights. And the Federalist Papers is a group of essays that the founders, the three founders, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison wrote to really reflect how to interpret the Constitution and understand the Constitution. They were written as newspaper articles, as newspaper essays to the public.
Yeah, to get
Yeah.
the Constitution passed.
Now, can you imagine the Washington Post or LA Times publishing the Federalist Papers? For us to read. That's the way it was back then. To get that information about the Constitution, what it meant. Did that answer your question?
Sort of. I know I have some reading to do.
We all do.
No, I wasn't going in that direction, but okay, go ahead, sir.
Keith, who is it that the principal and the vice principal think will be offended by the Pledge of Allegiance?
They believe, well, let's put it to you guys, they are offended. They're the only ones offended. The kids aren't offended. I mean, the kids who pass up the opportunity, they just do it out of ignorance, but the kids, most of the kids were just acknowledging me. They acknowledged the Pledge of Allegiance. And when I asked them, I said, what are we pledging our allegiance to? Just like when we had the football play, the Kaepernick gives, with the knees and all that, taking a knee. I said, why do you think it's important to stand erect, to stand and put your hand over your heart and so forth? And they said, well, the military, some people say that. I said, yeah, that's one reason. But you know what the main reason is to me? We are pledging allegiance to a republic, for which it stands, one nation under God. So I give my allegiance to a constitutional republic, not a democracy. You hear that word democracy all the time, even on the right. You hear them talking about democracy, democracy. No, this is not a democracy. Of course, it may have digressed.
Right.
It looked like one.
Yeah, it is. It's starting. Yeah.
Keith, tell a principal's ethnicity.
The administration, the principals, that's the administration, and the kids are Latino.
95.
95%. Thank you, Miss Cage is also a teacher.
Mexifornia here.
Yeah, that's it. So basically, and I'm not, again, I don't want to sound, I hope that doesn't come out wrong. I mean, like a bad thing. It's just that I've had black kids come up to me saying, I don't like the, this is my class, I don't want to keep, and they don't want to go to class, they don't want to go, and they're rebelling. I said, why? Because most of the kids, because these kids are all speaking Spanish in the class. And then I say, well, does the teacher speak Spanish or English? The teacher speaks English. Well, listen to the teacher, not the kids. I mean, I have to tell them that to, get them to understand that in a system that is seems against you, first of all, understand who the enemy is. Understand what system it is that is against you. It is not this system. And this is what I tell them. It is not the system the founders gave us. It's some other kind of system that is now contrary to the Constitution. This is what interests them. Now they're saying, oh, now I have a reason to look at it. Because this is not the system the founders gave us. So what is this system that I don't like, that I reject? Okay, so anyway.
That's
You
the
got it.
time.
Oh,
Susan.
boy, that time went so fast.
No, we got we got a half
I'll
hour
make it
left.
One more quick.
Okay, real quick, but
He's not quick.
okay. But just like with the course on the 10th and 17th Amendment, I bet you all learned something too, didn't you? Listen, real quick, Keith. As one who's known you for a long time.
Hold on. Okay, so I don't want to rush everybody, and this is really, really good, but we have to be done at 3 o'clock, and we have another speaker to speak.
I'll make it real quick.
30 seconds.
Okay. As one who's known you for a long time, explain to people, what I believe is the key to your success, what you call the Colombo principle. A lot of us don't remember
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And that's really what the example you gave. I know what you were doing.
Yeah.
And the example, that's why you had the feeling.
Okay. Well, it's a tactic that you guys, everybody here, let's see, you guys are close to my age. I mean, I'm an old guy, so let's see. Anyway, if you guys remember the TV series with Peter Colombo?
Yes.
I don't know my wife. She's always saying that, things like this. That, I have a question for you. You just ask the kids that, or ask the people you're talking to. You frame it as a question. Everything, especially when you talk to the real hardcore left. If you frame everything as a question instead of a statement, you will have more opportunity to have a conversation. And just play dumb. Act as if you don't know anything. Just you're gathering your fact line. You're finding it, getting information. Like with the Kavanaugh thing. Michael was really good at this, and later she can talk to you. She would ask certain things about the Kavanaugh thing. And I'll tell you this real quick, and then I'm done. Real quick, my wife said something to me this morning, and she's not really into politics. She doesn't really care much for it. But this has made her pay attention. What's going on with Kavanaugh? So she said, so there was a radio show called Fari Hutchinson's radio show. He's a far leftist, and he was talking about how women. You got to believe women all the time. Women are the ones that they're telling the truth all the time, and men who do these things, they're just scum. They're just all over. And so my wife said, "Well, ask Ofari, what about the Emmett Till and the men who were persecuted and hung black men because white women falsely accused them of rape? What about all those black men who were hung because white women falsely accused them of rape and they got no trial, no due process?" Is that what the Democrats are trying to do here? Yes, that's exactly what they're doing. But anyway, I digress.
One really great use of your tax dollars is the National Archives website. Go to the National Archives website. Go to Google or some other search engine and search for National Archives. And there you can find the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, the Declaration, all the founding documents. Lots of explanatory information, a great resource for every American, a good use of your tax dollars. Check it out, the National Archives. Our next speaker, I'm pleased to introduce. Oh, I don't have my phone.
Just buy this book, everybody.
I would like to bring up Davina Kaiser to recognize some of our sponsors. Davina?
Thank you, Susan. I get the honor of thanking all of our sponsors. And as I read your names, either just wave or stand up, whatever you would like to do. Microphone. You can't hear me?
Now.
Okay, I'll use my teacher voice because I just retired from teaching from Long Beach Unified.
Oh, all right.
Okay, so if you want to stand or just wave your hand, whatever is, that's fine. Jenny Schneider, it looks like he stepped out.
Yeah.
Okay, well, he was honored earlier, so he's one of our sponsors, and all these people are at this table. Awesome. And then we have the Torrance Lavina Republican Assembly. And Facebook at TLRA. So TLRA, if you want to go on Facebook. In the back here we have the Epic Times newspaper. And you can find them at theepictimes.com. Yeah, oh, I didn't know that, thank you. We have free papers on the table, so grab one on your way out. And last but not least, we have Sylvester Bland of the United Saints of America Live Internet TV. And you can view them at the United Saints of America on Facebook daily, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. So check it out. Thank you.
Okay, now, our next speaker, Mr. Douglas Gibbs, is the president of the Constitution Association, a radio host, an author. You can get his books on Amazon, Kindle or paperback. This is The Basic Constitution, and this is We the People, 25 Myths of the United States Constitution. Amazon.com, Douglas Gibbs. Come up. He is a radio host and author, a public speaker, and an outspoken proponent for the spread of constitutional literacy and patriotic advocacy. He's a fellow of the American Freedom Alliance, a sentinel for the Heritage Foundation, and an instructor on the United States Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, Doug Gibbs.
Cleanup, which means I don't have quite as much time, but see, when you hit a home run, it doesn't take as long, so it works out fine. Thanks for being here. And another great source, by the way, she was talking about sources for documents. The Avalon Project is another one which Yale University puts out, and I use that. And Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention in particular. Real quick on the Federalist Papers to finish answering that question. These were essays to the state of New York because New York was full of a lot of anti-federalists. In fact, the New York delegation actually got up and walked out during the Constitutional Convention, leaving the one guy they shouldn't have left by himself, Alexander Hamilton, who was a big government guy. I was thinking, you know, if you're a bunch of anti-federalists, you're worried about big government, you don't want to leave the big government guy by himself in this convention. But nonetheless, that's what they did. And everybody knew back then that as New York goes, so goes the nation. So the essays were written to New York to convince them to ratify the Constitution. The belief was if New York ratified the Constitution, the other states would follow. I wanted to read a Bible verse to you real quick. Galatians 5:1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. I think it's very appropriate when it comes to the U.S. Constitution, understanding that. And, you know, it's funny. We were talking about education earlier, and I have a nephew named Brandon, and he's basically a younger version of me, which just tears my brother to pieces, and of course I egg it on. And in 6th grade, he had the opportunity to go through his history class, and there was a whole chapter on the Constitution in his history book. And he was very excited, because Uncle Doug talks about the Constitution. And they got to that chapter and they skipped over it. And he went to the teacher and he asked her why, and I quote, "You have to understand, Brandon, we only have so much time, so we have to skip over what's not important."
Wow.
Common Core, man, it's worse than Common Core at this point. You know, when it comes down to the whole Constitution, the whole basis, the whole foundation is our natural rights. And our natural rights, well, you've heard they're God-given, right? Our rights come from God, natural law, natural rights that come from God. You know, it's funny, they're God-given rights. It says so in the Declaration of Independence, and my mentor that really straightened me out on the Constitution, I've been studying the Constitution my whole life, but it was about a dozen years ago that my mentor really straightened me out. And one time we were on a radio program together, and he was talking about God-given rights this, God-given rights that, and I turned to him, I said, "Wait a second. I thought you said to me once you're an agnostic." He says, "Not when it comes to my rights."
Wow.
Now, when it comes to our rights, we have to understand that it's all about authorities. I'm so glad that Steve Jackson touched on enumerated powers and how they're expressly granted or expressly enumerated in the Constitution, meaning that the federal government, remember the Constitution, this thing here, is a contract, it's a social contract, and in contract law it's very simple. Either it's in the contract or it's not. It's not a living, breathing document. It's not all about the precedent law. Either it's in the contract or it's not. And that's the way it was written. And in Federalist paper, getting back to the Federalist papers, number 45, and this is one of my favorite quotes, and actually Steve Jackson touched on a part of it. This is what James Madison wrote. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation of foreign commerce, with which the last the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state.
Wow.
Lives, liberty, and property. In other words, he was saying that it's okay if states make laws regarding our rights. Federal government can't. Bill of Rights was written to the federal government to tell them they can't touch our rights. None of your business. Congress shall make no law, shall not be infringed. No soldier shall not be violated. Those are the first four. That's from the first four amendments. Our rights are natural rights. They belong to you. How many of you remember how to recite the preamble from school? Were you taught? Do you still remember?
Yeah.
All right. Now, I'm not going to make you do it, so don't get embarrassed. I was at another Los Angeles event. I don't know. It was about 6 months ago, something like that. I was at Trump National, and I was given 2 minutes. I have the gift of gab. That's not right. I got the gift of gab from my mother. Whenever my mom's on the phone with me, my wife always knows because I'm not talking. But anyway, so I asked the crowd if they could recite the preamble with me, we the people of the United States. And once they were going through it, and only one person in this crowd of about 200 people joined me. She, interestingly enough, looked like she was also probably the eldest person in the room. And I was stunned. So I decided, okay, I'll recite it, but I want to tell them something about it, and I'm going to tell you the same thing I told them. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure peace and tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. Okay. Have you ever looked at the words where it says, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity?
Yes.
Look very carefully at those words, ourselves. As a matter of fact, you can look it up right now on page 1, which is about third or fourth page in. The word ourselves is lowercase, the word posterity is capitalized. There's good reason for that. Because they signed that document for you. They did not italicize back then. They were handwriting the document. They didn't pull out the old Microsoft Word program and hit Control-I. They capitalized often for emphasis, and the emphasis is on posterity. So, in other words, the way they were saying that is secure the blessings of liberty, yes, to ourselves, yes, but especially to those not yet born, our posterity. They signed it for you. They did it for you. And there's another word there that's very curious, the word secure. And secure also appears in the Declaration of Independence. If you go to page 35 of your pocket Constitution, you'll notice where it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it says to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The word secure is used, not protect, not guarantee. We're told all the time, Constitution protects our rights, and the government's there to guarantee our rights. No. The greatest threat against your rights is the federal government. So if the federal government can protect you from them, they're going to hold up a shield. Don't worry, I've got a shield to hold me against you. Well, that's ridiculous, right? They're not there to guarantee our rights. They're there to secure them. Like a child is secured in the car seat, you protect the child by not driving like an idiot. But if there is an accident, that child is secured. It's not moved, it's not dislodged. A child does not go flying out of that seat because they are secure. Your rights are God-given, they're given to you, and they are supposed to remain within your possession. Secured in your possession. Government was instituted to restrain themselves and others so that your rights remain secure in your possession. You know, it's funny because when I talk about this, a lot of people get confused. They say, well, then who's supposed to protect my rights? You are. They're yours. When I park my car out there, I lock the door, especially since I have a Trump sticker in the back window and I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay, window.
You know, it's funny because a woman one time, she says to me, boy, you are really brave having that Trump sticker in the back of your car. I said, you know what? Think about what you just said. I'm not worried about a paint job. I'm willing to stand firm for what I believe no matter what, even if it means getting jumped, and trust me, I have been. And I love dealing with Antifa. I walked up to Antifa. I was actually speaking at University of California, Riverside. They had me sign a no harm form. In other words, if I got beat up, they weren't liable. So and Antifa is lining up the interest. I got to get through Antifa to get to my event to speak. And this one that says, the shirt says, Trump is a fascist. And I turned around and said, Trump is a fascist. He says, yeah, Trump's a fascist. And I said, I bet you like gun control too. He says, yeah. And I said, you want all the fascists to take away your guns, right? He had nothing to say after that. Sometimes you gotta speak their language. Ted, it is so good to see you, my friend. You snuck in.
Yeah.
I think the last time I saw you, you were out in Murrieta speaking to a tea party. I think the last time I saw you. Ted Hayes is an incredible individual. If you don't know him, get to know him. And speak to him. He's incredible. You said, Steve Jackson, earlier you said that most people that said that 80 to 85% of the federal government is unconstitutional. Back in 2006, 2 years before the name that shall not be said. Well, I don't use profanity in my speeches, so I try not to use those things. A friend of mine and I, the one who was the agnostic who loves his God-given rights, we studied all of federal spending. We separated it into two piles: constitutional and not constitutional. You're dead on. 85% was unconstitutional. That was back then. After the last, 8 years before this president, I'm not even sure now. So that is important. Now, understand, what do we do though? If our natural rights are ours, what does that mean? That means that in order to hang on to our natural rights, which are self-evident to us because we are a virtuous people. See, a not moral people, a not virtuous people is not self-evident to them. That's why they believe that killing their own children while they're still in the womb is not evil. It is not self-evident to them. But if we're a virtuous people, we understand all that. Benjamin Franklin said only a virtuous people is capable of freedom. It's funny because I think about this. What has happened? Well, what comes after he says that? Have you ever read that quote by Benjamin Franklin where he says only virtuous people is capable of freedom? You know what comes after that? He says, and I want to word it right, so I'm looking for it now. All right. Only virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. Corrupt and vicious. So I'm watching TV one time, and there was some riot going on somewhere. I think it was Ferguson or Baltimore or something. And the guy gets up in the camera and he says, well, this is what democracy looks like. And I said, you're exactly right. Mob rule. That's what happens when we're not virtuous people. That kind of stuff. Not knowing which bathroom to use. That's what happens when we're not virtuous people. One time, my granddaughter, I take her wiener schnitzel, and she had to go potty, and she's like 5, so I'm worried, but she doesn't want to use the boys' bathroom anymore like I used to just take her into. So she's in the bathroom, and then she's in the stall, standing there in the doorway, the door open, this woman walks up, she kind of gives me a dirty look and said, don't look at me like that. I self-identify as an angry grandmother right now. The problem is because we've stopped being a virtuous people, we've allowed something to happen. We have professional politicians. And these professional politicians have told us that they know what the Constitution says. You don't. You're too stupid. And it's funny because someone asked me not too long ago about the history of all this stuff. We go back to something called the General Will. Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked about the General Will. He was one of the people who was behind the French Revolution. And he said, well, there's a will of the people were too stupid to recognize, so therefore the ruling elite has to apply it. Because, and I quote, because man must be forced to be free. Wasn't that what they're doing with net neutrality, right? Only if the government takes over it, then you're free. You must be forced to be free. Same kind of principles. They are using those same kind of principles. The fact is, your natural rights belong to you, and because your natural rights belong to you, they are yours to defend And so what are you going to do about it? When was the last time you went to a city council meeting? When was the last time you marched in a rally? Now I know I'm a room full of patriots. For the most part, you guys aren't the problem. But there was this woman named Elizabeth Powell. You ever heard this story about Benjamin Franklin coming out of the Constitutional Convention? And a woman on a hill, grassy hill, meets him. She's wearing a bonnet. She says, "Sir, Doctor, what have you given us? A monarchy or a republic?" It actually, the true story, it actually wasn't on a grassy hill. It was in a room, but it sounds better on the grassy hill, so we'll stick with grassy hill. And he says, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." If you can keep it. She couldn't even vote. How could she keep the republic? Well, first of all, it's not a democracy, so voting's not the most key part, is it?
Thank you.
See, in a democracy, you vote once a year, and you spend the other 364 days complaining. And that's it. But in a republic, there's so much more work to do, isn't there?
Yes.
So what could she do to keep the republic? Well, Elizabeth Powell was the wife of a gentleman by the name of Samuel Powell. Samuel Powell was the mayor of Philadelphia, and together they owned a business that was what today we would call it a bed and breakfast. And they offered the most opulent dinners to attract the most notable travelers so that the George Washingtons of the day would stay at their place. In fact, during the Constitutional Convention, it is said that 2/3 of George Washington's evening meals was at the Powell House. And so after dinner, they would retreat to the parlor and they'd light their pipes and they'd talk politics. And Elizabeth Powell would do something that most women of the day didn't do. She'd follow them into the parlor and argue with them. And she had a sharp tongue, she was very informed, she knew what she was talking about, and she did not back down. Reminds me a lot of my wife. And she developed relationships with these people. It was not unheard of to see her and George Washington strolling the streets talking politics. In fact, they became very good friends, and there's a lot of correspondence that they wrote back and forth to each other. In fact, when George Washington was completing his first term and he really was getting tired and he did not wish to continue, he wrote a letter to James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Elizabeth Powell saying, "I really don't want to serve a second term, but everybody seems to be demanding one." And it was Elizabeth Powell that returned him with a letter that said, "George, you are the foundation here of this Constitution. If you don't serve a second term, it will be seen by those who are against the Constitution," she was referring to the Anti-Federalists, "as an abandonment of it. And they will use that." It was she that convinced him to serve that second term. It was she that convinced him to use the term Mr. President, as a matter of fact. In fact, you can see the letters between the two of them at the Powell House and at Mount Vernon. There's some of the letters at both locations. And here's something that I noticed. Let me back this up with this. One time a woman says to me, "Well, Doug, do you think there was any impropriety there?" And I said, "No, and I know that for a fact. Because if you look at all of George Washington's letters, the wax seal was Martha Washington's stamp." She read every one of those letters, I guarantee you. Now, I want to go over one more thing, and I really want to just reinvigorate and really pound into the podium what Steve had to say about enumerated powers. Article 1, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. Go to it, page 1. It's right under the preamble. Let's go over it real quick. I got 1 minute left before my home run is over. So we're going to do this quickly. It says, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress." What does the word "all" mean? All. Politicians seem to think it means something else, but it means all. What are legislative powers? Laws, but what about laws? So the power to create law, the power to modify law, the power to repeal law, right? All legislative powers herein. Herein, what does herein mean? And the 8-year-old once said to me, "Well, gosh, herein." Exactly. All legislative powers herein granted. If something's granted, then there's a grantor and there's a grantee. The grantee is Congress. Who's the grantors?
People.
The states. The states held all the powers. They have original authority over all the states. Yeah, we the people through our states, but the states held all the authorities. The states are the parents of the federal government. They created it. They're the grantors. They're the vestors. They're the ones that created the Frankenstein monster. Unfortunately, it's been running amok and they've done nothing about it. Our states are the parents, which means they have a right to tell federal government, nuh-uh, I'm not instituting that. That's unconstitutional. That's called the power of nullification, which Mr. Jackson went over. So all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested, shall be, it's not a question, vested, that's a legal transfer of power, shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. And the two houses, the House and the Senate, are two separate houses, bicameral Congress that are supposed to be different from each other. 17th Amendment ruined that. Because when two houses are different, they're different from each other, then they will be a natural check against each other. But now, because the states no longer appoint the U.S. senators, they have to live under laws that they had no say in. And finally, I'll wrap it up with this. In Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, it says that Congress is required to meet at least once per year. I like do-nothing Congresses. The less they're there, the less damage they can do. There are actually people who argued that was too often here in the convention. Because the federal government's authorities only had to do with external issues. And basically the response was, if we're not at war, why should we be in Congress? I have a store to keep. I have a doctor's office to keep. I have a farm to keep. They're not supposed to be professional politicians. Federal government was created to serve the states and to serve us, not for them to rule over us. And that is the story of the Constitution. Thank you. All right, Gary, you got your hand up quick.
Doug, so 85%, whatever the number is, of the federal government is violating the Constitution. If someone brought a lawsuit,
legislatures, and then also, and Steve, I know he's going to cringe when I say this, because he and I, this is the only thing we disagree on, an Article 5 convention. I support the idea of an Article 5. Now that said, I thank him and his compadres that say, hey, you know, that's a bad thing to be a runaway convention. I said, I hope you still believe that when there is one, because you'll make sure there isn't, because you're so far hard against that. And it's my fail-safe. But I believe that's also one of the things. Clarence.
Quick question for you.
It's good to see you, my friend.
Clarence. Maybe for all of you. In light of what's going on with the cabinet, one of the overriding things I'm hearing from a lot of people that I expect on to do what you do on the national level is what's at stake with the 4th, 5th, and especially the 6th Amendment. If this thing goes through where he's nullified, we basically have become a modern democracy and not a republic, because we've said you no longer have a right to face your accuser, have presumption of innocence.
Right.
The 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment.
Well, due process went
Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah.
Right.
And it goes a little deeper than that. Unfortunately, it is that important, and it shouldn't be. Our courts should not have the kind of power they have. Technically, they are not supposed to be the final arbiters of the Constitution. They're not supposed to decide whether or not laws are constitutional or not. That's an idea called a judicial review, which was put into place by a justice, John Marshall, in 1803 Marbury versus Madison. So the very first red flag to go up is that the judges gave themselves that authority. Second of all, if the federal government, let me back up, the Constitution is supposed to be a limiting document. That means it's supposed to be limited powers. So what we're saying, though, is that if a case goes to a federal court, they can determine whether or not it's constitutional. What that means is whether or not the federal government has the authority over what's in that law. In other words, the federal government is deciding for themselves through the courts what their own authorities are. How is that limited government? So our biggest problem is that the courts have that kind of power in the first place.
Yeah.
But now that we're stuck with it, now we've got due process being tossed out the window because they hate Trump, ultimately. And I know it's Kavanaugh, the McCallum interview, Martha McCallum, when he says, well, I was a virgin in high school, and many years afterwards, I could hear Democrat heads explode. Not because they thought he might be lying, but because they didn't think there was anybody such thing that would have that kind of virtue.
Right.
That's not possible, because we're all a bunch of decrepit, you know, well, because you are doesn't mean everybody else is. It's like the person who's high thinks everybody's high.
That's all the time we have.
I'm done, I guess.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.